So excited to have you here. So this is our Conversations in Global Health, and I think this is our fourth guest. So I am thrilled to have my friend Dr. Daniela Ligiero, join us tonight, and she is the CEO of Together for Girls. And we're just going to have a conversation about your work, what brought you to the work that you're doing now, and the path that got you here. And I know that our students are really excited to hear about it. So I just want to sort of start off before I get to where your path to get where you are. Can you just explain a little bit about your CEO role now and what Together for Girls does?
Well, first of all, let me say thank you so much to Maeve and to John for inviting me over. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, so what do I do as a CEO? So a little of everything is actually part of that answer. So we, as hopefully I know you read some materials before you came, are a public-private partnership that includes over 6 UN agencies, private sector, governments working in 22 countries to end violence against children, but with special attention to sexual violence and to gender issues. And as the CEO, I've been there for 2.5 years now. It's been great. I will say, and I think I've mentioned this to you, Maeve, it's the job I've enjoyed the most so far, because I'm a very dynamic person and I get to do a lot of very different things on a daily basis. So whether it's thinking about budgets and management issues, all the way to going out into the field and meeting people and politicians and leaders, or being at the UN giving a speech, or sitting down with some data, which I love, and really diving in and doing the scientific work. I get to do a little of all of that. And for me, it's been really fantastic to be in that position. Yeah.
I love that this is the job you love the most because you've had so many incredible jobs. And so, I mean, sort of going back, you've always been interested in children. And so how did that become sort of your jumping off spot, place?
Yeah, I'll say, the driver for me has really been social justice, I think is where I start. And I actually came to the work with children from the gender space. So I started off my career really thinking about social justice, gender inequality. I did a lot of work on gender-based violence. And the more I started looking at this, sexual reproductive health, that's so linked to gender inequality, the more I started to understand how to change the things we're trying to change, you have to start early. You just have to. You're not, yeah, because there's so much, and hopefully we'll get into it a little bit today. There's so much around the way we see the world, the way our experiences as children shape us into the adults we become. And some of this stuff that I work on, it's not easy, it's long term, it's not like a vaccine. It's not like you can just say, here's a shot and then you're done, you're cured. Social change requires generations sometimes. And so you have to start early. And that's kind of how I came to the world of children.
And maybe because we have also guests in the room who didn't read up quite as much about your background. Can you sort of walk through about, what did you do when you were at UNICEF? And where did that path take you from there into PEPFAR?
Yeah, so maybe I'll take a step back. So
take a step back. Go back.
So
back to
the beginning.
After you were a child, but before you
Seriously. Well, I would have started high school because it's a good thing, but it's also been a challenge, and that's why I love this job so much. I've always been interested in a ton of different things, and it's always been hard for me to pick because I love math and science, and for a while I thought I was going to be a physicist. But I also love people and this idea of social change. And I love to travel. And I come from, my dad was in the Foreign Service, in the Brazilian Foreign Service. My mom actually took the test to be in the US Foreign Service, but at the time they couldn't marry because it was illegal to do so. So unfortunately she gave up her career. But, I traveled all over the world growing up, and there was so much I wanted to do. And so for me, really what happened was I went to undergrad as a psychologist. I ended up getting a PhD in counseling and community psychology on the issues I mentioned, focused on gender-based violence, sexual reproductive health, those kinds of things, and abuse of children as well. And the more I got into these issues, the more I realized that to create impact at scale, you have to look at policy. And you have to look at, because, it's great to work one-on-one, and there are people that are born for that, and that's fantastic. But I was really excited about the big scale change. And so I finished my PhD. Really, I had no clue what I was going to do because I had been studying to be a therapist and a researcher. And all of a sudden, that's not what I wanted to do. So I did the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science Fellowship, which many of you probably already know about. But anyway, and I spent a year on the Hill. And I worked in the US Senate there for a year and fell in love doing global health. And I knew that I was never going back to academia. I was never going to be who knows, I might someday still do that. But from there, worked the US government for a while. I worked at the World Bank, really starting off my career. I think the game changer for me was UNICEF, and you just mentioned that. And at UNICEF, I had the opportunity to be posted in, and you stop me if I'm going too long.
No.
This is good?
This is perfect. And
Okay.
I always think of you as starting in UNICEF, so I forgot
Yeah.
what you did before.
Yeah, no, the Senate is where I found my calling for policy and the kinds of things I do now. Was really around, I worked in Brazil, the UNICEF country office in Brazil, which is the second largest in the world, and working on sexual reproductive health as the chief of HIV there, bringing this attention to children, to adolescents, because if you're going to prevent HIV among adolescents, you gotta talk about sexual reproductive health and gender identity and sexual orientation and violence and all those things that I loved. And to be able to really put that in practice, to actually be in charge of something with a budget where I could make decisions about, with partners in government around where did we need to invest, and to see, I was there for almost 5 years, kind of the impact of that over time at a country level. Because we work with the Ministry of Health and Education. We created this whole program that still exists, although now there's a new president that might roll all this back, unfortunately, that looks at, within high schools, it's mandatory to have classes on reproductive health, on gender identity, sexual orientation, all the stuff that, frankly, here we don't do, or in a lot of other countries, and that became institutionalized. And one of the things we saw was very quickly HIV rates, unintended pregnancy rates started to drop. I mean, it was just phenomenal. And this is a country that has 180 million people in it. So, that kind of impact really sold me on, this is what I want to do.
I'm not paying attention to my own rules. I just love your passion for the intersection between data and policy, for the intersection between the people that you're helping and the leadership skills that it needs in order to do that job. And I guess, for our students who are also exploring about, what is going to be their field? Are they going to be more, do they want to go into data science? Do they want to, go do into public health policy? I would just love you to talk a little bit more about where you think we are on that data policy interface, and where you see sort of the future is. We talk about data being cheap, but needs to be accessible.
That's a great question. I think this, I've found myself always in that space between science and policy, and there is a big space there, as you probably know. I mean, it was astounding to me that when I was doing research and in academia, we would do these studies, we would publish them in journals that then only we would read, and it was just very incestuous and so separate from, I remember going to the Hill, and this was actually a really fun experience because I worked for Senator Jeff Bingaman at the time, who was a Democrat from New Mexico, fantastic guy, who was trying to start with Durbin and others, the Global Fund, and so I was engaged in some of that really fun stuff. the Global Fund for AIDS, TB, and Malaria. There was some vote on the Global Fund, and he said, okay, you need to tell me how I'm going to vote. And so I went back, and it was like my first week there, and I was so excited, and I wrote a 10-page paper with all the evidence and the data, and I turned it in to, the person who was going to kind of hand it over to him in our meeting. And she started laughing, and she said, there is absolutely no way that
No one writes a 10-page paper on
it just, she's like, no, you need to go back, and I need you to tell us what we need to do in 2 paragraphs. And I thought, holy cow, that is impossible. And she said, well, then you're in the wrong place. And so I think somewhere in between, how you translate evidence, data, science for decision makers without, and now we've gone overboard. I mean, there's a tweet, you have to say it in a sentence. Somewhere in between, there's got to be a medium where we can still be thoughtful and think about what it is we know, what it is we don't know, but also communicate that in a way that is useful for people to make decisions. And so I think there's a huge need, there's a huge gap there, and I find that people that can navigate both worlds are rare, but very helpful. And so I can, I think that's one of the skill sets I bring. I mean, I can sit with you. I mean, I wrote a dissertation. I could do that, and I can go into the data analytics and the RCTs and all that language, but I can also sit with someone today, because I've learned after many years, and tell them this is how you should vote, and here are the 3 reasons why.
No, and you're clearly, you're a great communicator, and you're so passionate, especially, and able to communicate about really, really hard issues. The things that you work on are some of the, really the hardest issues, and issues that many people couldn't devote their careers to, especially as a mother of young children. And so where do you, I mean, you've been working on these issues for a couple years. Where do you see, where are we on violence against children? What are you hopeful about? What do you see as the future of your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I will say, on a personal note, I mean, I've been very open about this for a long time. One of the things that for me was also instrumental in terms of guiding me to this work is the fact that I'm a survivor of sexual violence in childhood. And I started telling my story very publicly about 10 years ago, where not a lot of people were doing it, because I felt like it was so important to start breaking the silence around these issues. There is this illusion that somehow violence against children, and here I'm not talking just about sexual violence, all kinds of violence against children, it's something that happens over there, in that community, in that country, not where I am, not in my space. And how powerful it was. I mean, I remember the first time I told my story very publicly was actually at a UN event at the Commission on the Status of Women, and I spoke, and I talked about that and what we needed to do and moving forward. And I had 3 different ministers from African countries, women, come up to me and hug me and start crying and say, I'm also a survivor, and I've never had the courage to actually talk about this. And so I think that example of breaking the silence is a really important first step, and I'm so excited about what we're living in right now. The fact that, Me Too and all these scandals in the Catholic Church, and I grew up in a Catholic family, and this is everywhere. This is everywhere, and for us to be able to acknowledge that this is happening and it's happening everywhere is such an important first step. Malala once said that when the entire world is silent, even a single voice can become powerful. And I think that's what we've started to see is, one voice after the other, and now it's bigger than any of us imagined. So I think the first step is breaking that silence, and we've done that not only through amplifying voices of survivors, but through data, because data, when you have the CDC, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, come in and do one of the surveys that we do as part of our work at a country level and say 33% of the girls in Malawi experienced some form of sexual violence before the age of 18, and 16% of the boys at a country level, it's hard to argue with that because it is the gold standard for data collection now. And so that whole data piece is also about you can't say, oh yeah, that's one case over here. It's, you have the data to back it. That and the voice of survivors is very powerful. So I think now, we've spent the last 20 years doing a lot of research on it's happening, here it is, it's bad, showing the problem. I think now the next big step, and something we're really investing in right now in my organization, is the story right now is it's bad and it's happening everywhere. That's not a very hopeful story. It leaves you overwhelmed. The story needs to be it's bad, it's happening everywhere. It doesn't have to be this way. We know what works to prevent violence, and everyone has a role to play. Everyone. And so we just finished last year, we did this with something called the Fuller Project that does media research. We were looking at, in the US over the last several years, the stories. And 98% of the media stories that focus on sexual violence at large, this isn't just children, talk about the problem. Something bad happened, someone did something bad, someone was convicted. Less than 2% of the stories talk about solutions, prevention. And so we're getting ready to launch, we've been doing for the last year and a half an evidence review with several of our partners like WHO and others of what works to prevent sexual violence in children and adolescents. There is so much that has been shown to work. And we, even in the US, don't do a tenth of it. We just don't do it. And so for us, I think then that message of we know what needs to be done, we should just do it. And then the role, parents have a role, teachers have a role, governments have a role. Everyone has, so it doesn't just also feel like something, oh yeah, the government needs to do that or someone else out there. And so we have a lot of work right now that's on that next piece of the story.
Sure. So we trade mics.
Okay.
So, no, I just, I guess I would just, this, I was thinking that what's really powerful is what you just said. This sometimes I find scientists or others will say, if people would just listen to the data, it would be just fine, right? Or you listen to personal stories alone and want to be moved by that. What's amazing about your work is you combine the two. And I think if part of our audience here are future public health leaders, it's a little bit of not falling into the trap of saying, if only anyone listened to my data, they would know the answer, or falling into the trap of living a life of anecdotes, right? And so it seems like you have done an amazing job of blending those two together. And I guess.
Well, first of all, thank you. But I think you're so right. You're so right. And as a psychologist, for me, so I have both. Like I have the kind of the understanding of how human beings think, and also I love data. I've done a lot of research. I've done, I like math. I always talk about there's data for computers and there's data for humans. And when you present something that is meant for a computer, long Excel spreadsheet with a lot of, this is statistically significant, for some people it's exciting, but that's a small group of folks, right? Like maybe some of the people around this room, I get excited about it. But for a lot of people, it's like, oh my God, I don't even know where to start with this. So this idea of translating data for humans, and what we know is you have to have a message, you have to make sense of the data for people. It's not just data, it's information. And that's data that's been analyzed, curated, and there's a message that you're trying to show that comes out of the data, and the personal story. We are at heart a civilization that has relied on stories forever. One of my favorite, there's the Peter Pan book, and this is actually this guy that does this amazing workshop on storytelling, and one of the things he first says is he said, you guys know Peter Pan, the lost boys, they never grew up. Why? Why do they say in the book they never grew up? Do you know? Because they didn't have someone to tell them stories, like a mother. Because stories is how we, as children and then adolescents and adults, learn values, learn morals. I mean, there's so much in storytelling. And so that's exactly what we've tried to do, is to combine the story with the numbers.
And like I said, I think you've done an amazing job there. I guess I also want, but I want to maybe press this on the point you made just before to Maeve's last question. The hopeful part of that agenda is real and it's very important, but it's really hard, right? Because if you're asking people to change the way they engage in the most intimate and personal aspects of their lives, if we're really going to make a society where there's less violence toward children, where women are valued in a different way, it really does mean everybody changing some core assumptions. So, how, are there powerful stories you use to break that barrier, to get men to think differently about how we relate to women, to think about how we include children and how we think about our society? Because it seems to me that's the rub. I mean, the horror part we get. Well, we don't do enough about, but at least that stories. It's that next part that's really hard. It seems to me. I don't think
Yes. Yes, it is hard. It is hard because it's about changing things that for so long have been seen as fundamental to who we are as people, to who we are as a society. At the end of the day, violence is about power. And power is tricky, whether it's the power that adults have over children, the power that men have over women, the power that certain racial groups have over other racial groups. You know, this is tough, and it really requires, to your point, reflection. It requires some deep thinking. But I also like to point out that we talk about stories, some powerful stories about how in not very long periods of time we've been able to change things. So last year I took my girls, I have a 10-year-old and a 6-year-old, my two girls, to the Museum of Industry in Baltimore. Has everyone ever been there? It was like a school field trip, and I went, and I was like, okay, and I probably wouldn't have gone. I loved it. And really what it shows is the factories that were out there in Baltimore about a century ago, producing cans and seafood and all kinds of things. But what I didn't anticipate as part of the tour is they have a lot of photographs, and they show you, here's the place where the children used to work. And they would show you the things that they would do because their hands were little. They could do certain things that the adults couldn't. And I mean, 100 years ago, if you were a child and you didn't have money, you didn't go to school. Like, you worked in the factories. Whether you were white or black, you just worked. And today, it is unthinkable that we would do that to a child. Children are still out of school, absolutely, but we have changed as a society in terms of accepting that it's not okay for kids to work. So why can't we get to a place where it's not okay to beat a child, and it's not okay to, have a priest sexually molest children for decades and keep his job? Like, why can we not get to that place? So I think it's hard and it takes time, but there are these stories, and we've been able to change things that fundamentally people thought, well, this is just the way it is, So anyway, I have hope. Otherwise,
I do
can't
too.
this
No,
job.
but I think but I think stories of hope matter a lot too. I guess one other question before I hand this back to Maeve is, you notice, we have our class is mostly female students, and it does seem to me that one thing, and we had Beth Cameron here earlier, as one part of the series. I think women, I guess I'd love your advice in particular, about all of us, but to young women in particular, about, as you think about a career, what barriers have you seen to a woman as a scientist who you moved into the policy arena? What barriers have you seen? What opportunities do you see? Just any general advice before I hand this back over.
Yeah. And I hope the gender aspects of the work come out more. We didn't talk a lot about them, but especially when you're talking about sexual violence, I mean, you can't look at that without looking at a gender lens. And there's so much there that we're doing and thinking about. And that doesn't mean just girls. You said something earlier, I just want to go back to it for a moment, which was the importance of engaging men. And that is so important in this conversation around what does it mean to have power and to not even realize it in some ways, and how are you using that power? Again, it's the same thing that, any kind of privilege situation, if you have money, if you're white, if you're, I mean, you have to do that to be able to fully understand what that privilege comes from and what's the impact, right, on the people around you. So anyway, we could talk a little more about that. But for the barriers, I think that they're there, and I've experienced them, and I'm sure many people around this room have experienced barriers for whatever reason it is, whether it's your sexual orientation, your race, your gender. In my case, being half Brazilian and being identified as Latina has brought also, so there's sometimes these like mixed, levels that I have to, and I try to give people the benefit of the doubt, and then I'm like, where is that coming from? But they're there, and it's a reality. And whether it's subtle, because I think that's part of the challenge that we deal with today, is that a lot of the barriers are subtle. Like, no one's ever told me, I'm not going to give you this job because of X, because you're Latina, or because you're a woman, or it's so much more subtle than that. And so it really puts you in this situation where you're sometimes second guessing yourself and you're not sure. And I think it's what we're seeing in terms of racism in this country, in terms of classism in this country. It's all of a sudden you call it different things, you put it in different boxes, and it becomes sometimes not so subtle, unfortunately. But oftentimes, I think for me, the experience has been subtle. But what I always say is, you got to keep at it, and you got to pick your fights. And sometimes you have to take on the fights. You don't have to take on every fight, but you have to take on some of the fights. And it's not easy, and it can be lonely. And so one of the things I've really done that I think has been very powerful for me is I have this kind of group of folks in my life that have been mentors to me. Some of them are men, some of them are women. Eric Gooseby is one of them. I mean, what a great guy. He was our boss a while back, who have become mentors to me that I can go to and talk to and really talk through some of these situations, because I think a lot of times I was dealing with this stuff on my own and it was very lonely. And I found that I don't want to be lonely in this, and I want to connect with others. And it's the same thing that happened to me when I came out as a survivor. I was really worried that people would actually question whether I could be objective as a scientist because I had that experience, or if I could be, objective in any way, shape, or form. And that's been tough too, and that was actually quite terrifying 10 years ago. I mean, it's become less terrifying, but I thought people would think less of me and people would value my opinion less. And again, there are a lot of changes that are happening, but I do think for me, having that network and not feeling so alone in it has been helpful.
I really, I really appreciated what you said about the subtleness of the discrimination, because I think that a lot of people feel like the issues that they didn't affect them because it's not an overt act of violence. There's emotional violence. There's other pieces that go on, and I think that there are underlying struggles, and to be aware of that and use that as something that's part of everyone's story. But we have a number of students who have prepared questions for you, and I could keep doing this all night, but I know that I need to sometimes turn it. So I'm going to turn it to our first student.
Laura, you want to start? Okay, excellent. Oh, I'm sorry. However you guys want.
Hi, my name is Armel. I'm a third-year student here studying neurology and global health.
Yeah, thank you, Armel. Yeah, so thank you, Armel. But just you did a perfect job. But I'm just going to say that everyone, if you say your full name, first and last, and what you're studying and your year, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you for for coming out to speak with us tonight. So I think that violence against girls usually comes from this cultural, or a lack of a cultural value for girls. So my question is, how does Together for Girls try to navigate these delicate and oftentimes ingrained sentiments towards female children in the work that you do?
should I answer each one individually or?
That's generally how
Okay, yeah, otherwise I have to write it down
Okay.
because I'm not going to remember more than one question. So,
We've got
yeah.
4 initial questions,
Then we'll take it. That is a great question. I think, this conversation around what is cultural and what is a human right has been going on for a while. And I'm sure you've touched on it. I mean, I think one of the really important things that we did in the last century is recognizing as, a global community that human beings have certain rights. And that a right free from violence, a right to an education, are rights. And so, so that you don't have to go down this path of is this cultural or not, et cetera. So I think that's a good starting point. That's really important to remember as a North Star, because otherwise it all gets very relative very quickly, People defended slavery because it was cultural, But now we look back and we say, oh my gosh, that didn't quite make sense. And so it really is a product of our times. I do think as an organization, to your question, one of the things that we really do is work at country level in the countries where we work with leaders in country. Because there are people out there in these communities who are from these communities who are saying girls need to be valued, children need to be valued. We have to, this isn't okay. And so part of our work becomes how do we help amplify those voices, support those voices, versus having, a foreigner come in and say, oh, this is wrong. I mean, that's, so it's really about finding those leaders, and they're there. They're there in every community. But in some cases, it's hard. I mean, we have indices that show how countries are doing in terms of valuing women and girls and gender equality. And some countries do better than others. And the ones that do the worst, do horrific things to women and girls. And so that's a hard shift. But I think continuing to approach it from a human rights perspective and then empowering leaders in the communities that are driving that change is important.
Hi, I'm Laura Wenzel, and I'm a junior global health major in the School of Nursing and Health Studies. And my question is, so advocating for children specifically can obviously be quite challenging and complex because they face many uncontrollable factors and less power in their situations. So how do you go about policy and program implementation regarding children versus adults? How does that how does advocating for children change the way that you go about?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think one of the fundamental barriers that exist there is that children don't vote. Seriously. Because, and they don't have money. And they can't, go out and organize a protest unless they're teenagers. We're seeing more and more of that, which is awesome, going out and doing that. But I think it is hard and it is different because of all of these reasons, And so, I mean, it's a reality. I think we try to deal with it. I think they're always, on the other hand, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, it's really hard to say, I oppose something that's going to try to reduce violence against children. No matter where you are in the political spectrum, children is always one of those things that gets people going also. So we try to navigate, I think, those two worlds. But the reality is, if you look at an issue like violence against children or violence against women and girls, if you look at the magnitude of the problem, and for those of you, that are looking at this from a health perspective, in terms of how many health outcomes of interest are affected by violence, whether it's unintended pregnancy, suicide, mental health, so much substance use is affected by this. So if you look at the magnitude of the problem and its consequences and how much we're actually doing on it, it's pretty pathetic. Worldwide. There's very little in terms of resources. There's still so many policies that need to be put into place. So we have a long way to go. But again, I'm hopeful that we're on that path. I'm not going to see it in my lifetime, but maybe my children will.
Okay. Oh, okay. Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a junior in the School of Nursing and Health Studies. I'm also a global health major. I want to say thank you so much for coming to speak with us today and sharing your story. It means a lot. I guess one question I had, just kind of going back in time through your career path, you've had kind of a unique opportunity to work both within the US government and with a number of international organizations. So, have you seen the scope and flexibility within your career change in those different positions? And has this been affected at all by the political climate or the shifting sort of trends within our societies?
And I especially like that last part. um, yeah, so every organization is different. And for me, the ability, one of the things I really love about this job, in addition to the work itself and everything I said before, I didn't mention this before, is the flexibility. So as another thing I'm trying to balance is being a mom of young kids, Babe knows this well, and having a career and doing something I love. It's tough. It's really tough. The world is not set up for people with young children. It's not. And so, which is unfortunate. And hopefully in our lifetime, we'll see that change too, because there's no reason why it doesn't have to be this way. It's just because someone decided, just a little parentheses, that at the UN Foundation where I used to work, there's this program called Girl Up. They do awesome stuff with adolescent girls. They created a shared executive director position, and there are two women that share the executive director. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's brilliant. And they, they're doing it, and they each work half time, and they're doing a really cool. Anyway, that's just, it doesn't have to be this way. We have set up the system. So in this position, I have a lot of flexibility because I'm the boss. I love being the boss. If I had known that not having a boss was so good, I would have done it a while ago. I have a board and a leadership council, but it's different than having a boss. And having to come in every day, and I can work from wherever I am. And so that flexibility is awesome, but it comes because we're a small organization, and I'm in the position I'm in, et cetera. And there's not a lot of bureaucracy. When I want to do something, immediately there's some things we can do. There's some things I need all my partners to agree to, which is a whole nother can of worms. But anyway, I really like that. And it's very different from being at the Department of State, where there's certain requirements and there's security, and it's a huge organization, and you can't use the email from the house because of the security, and you have to be there. And I mean, so it's very different. I've enjoyed all the jobs I've had. And I think in part, it really depends on where you are on your trajectory and what are the kinds of things you value. If you value independence and if you value flexibility, maybe Department of State isn't the best place for you. But if you value being part, I loved working at the Department of State on PEPFAR because I felt like anything I did had such a humongous impact on so many people at once, and it was shaping the history of this country and the policy of this country. And that was, as an American, just amazing. And so I think you really have to find what it is you value. But yeah, every organization is going to be different. And big bureaucracies are very different from small organizations, as is academia is another place. So it's very different. So.
Hi, I'm Peyton. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. Thank you again for coming. My question is sort of on the lines of what you were just talking about. You've held so many positions at really huge organizations, but you've kept like this core passion through all of those positions. So how do you come into a job at a really big organization and still bring like your passion for girls and violence against young girls like to every position that you've held? Like, how do you incorporate that into your work?
Thanks, and thanks for walking me up. That was really nice. So I think I have moved around and I've done different kinds of jobs. For me, I am very fortunate in the sense that I feel that I will only be in a job that brings me joy. the Mary Kondo, like you pick it up, does it bring you joy? And of course, it's not going to bring you joy all the time. There are always going to be, but at the end of the day, does it fulfill you? Does it? And for me, it's been around making a difference on the issues I care about. Like, do I feel like in this position I am making that difference? At the end of the day, there's all the BS and all the other stuff that every job will have, but do I feel fulfilled? And in some cases, that's been the case for a while, but then it hasn't anymore, and I've left. And so I've part of, I think, the reason I've shifted is I've been, I have followed, that passion. And there have been situations where I've been in a job where I thought it was going to be something, and after a short period of time, I was like, yeah, that wasn't exactly, it's not working for both of us, and then I'm going to go do something else. So I think it does require a little courage, but I have, anyway, I have made a decision. I made a decision a long time ago that that's what I was going to do, and so that's how. Is at the end of the day, am I making an impact on these issues? And it could be through HIV, it could be focused on violence, it could be, but at the end of the day, am I contributing to social justice, to empowering girls and women, to making this a better world for kids, and somehow bringing in that violence piece, so.
I just actually have one. You had one question. Sorry to take it back, but the funding issue and the attention. I just realized in reflecting on it, there's a lot of you said of, look, everyone wants to address violence against children, but actually, if you look at how much violence is impacting so many other things in our health system, in our world, then it's not getting the attention. And I recognize that since you wear every hat, you also wear a fundraising hat, so this is probably something you struggle with every day. But how do you get more attention to an issue that so self-evidently is something everyone cares about, but what you need is the funding?
It's a great question. I will say it is part of the job I don't like as much. It's the fundraise. You got to do it. Yeah.
I mean, we make arguments about the health system. We make arguments about how, from an economics perspective, every business should invest in it. We make arguments from a national security perspective. I'm just wondering where you see that.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of pieces to this. I think going back to that initial narrative I mentioned, I think there's still more work we need to do on that. Because I think, again, we've done a lot of work on there's a problem and it's really bad. But stopping there, so what? So I think really, and that's why we're so invested now on solutions, on highlighting solutions, on what is the evidence. Because at the end of the day, my sense has been, and you've been in policymaker positions as well, first someone has to convince you there's a problem. And then the next question is, what's the solution? And how much is it going to cost me? So we still need to do more as a field, I think, on what are those solutions, showcasing them, pushing them. And frankly, we've done a very poor job on costing the solutions. We've costed a lot of the problem, but not as much on, and we can learn from HIV. They did so much in terms of, listen, this is how much it's going to cost per person, to put people on treatment. So there's more work still to be done there. And I also think at the end of the day, because some of the changes that we're asking for are so deep and structural, there is this movement that needs to happen. And I'm excited about the movement now, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do more. Because at the end, we talk about cycles of violence. I've stopped just saying, violence against this group or that group. We're seeing through our data, it's all cycles. So boys that experience violence in childhood are then much more likely to perpetrate as adults. Girls that experience, and now I'm talking just about sexual violence in childhood, are then much more likely to become victims of violence later in life. I mean, there's just so much that's happening here. And I think for us to interrupt these cycles, it means exposing how much of it is happening, a lot of it, as you all know, among very powerful people, that especially men who have a lot of power and have been using that power. And so, it's hard. So I don't want to underestimate that piece as well. So I think you need movements. But we need to do better in terms of what is it we're asking for? Like, what do we want a government to do? What do we want schools to do? What do we want? Something as basic as, just to give you a few examples, something as basic as extending statutes of limitations around when people can come forward with child sexual abuse. We know that for a lot of people, they don't come forward as children. They come out, later as adults, because a lot of times it's people in their lives that they've trusted, a coach, a priest, and it's scary, and there are all these issues, and we have the data for it. Simply doing something like that can allow more people to come forward. Why are we not, safeguarding in schools? I mean, background checks for people who work in organizations that serve children. We don't have that in this country as a law. It varies by state. I mean, there's some things that are just having a system. I did this event last year with some of the Olympians who were sexually abused by Larry Nassar, and we were talking about some proposals now being put on the table. There was no system in place to report someone like that. Zero. So, how are we allowing this to happen? And not just at the Olympic level. My girls play soccer, and there's no system. There's no, So again, there's just so much we need to do, but I think being more concrete around what is it we're asking for, I think can help. Anyway, I hope it can.
Other questions? Here we go.
Hi, my name is Eric. I'm actually a graduate student studying global health. But before coming to Georgetown, I worked on a research and evaluation team back in Boston, doing evaluations on child welfare and maltreatment programming and analyses. And before that, I was actually just a play therapist at a children's trauma center. On both of my teams, I was the only male. Right now in my cohort at Georgetown, out of 30 students, I'm one of 3 males. Why are, in general, males not interested in getting involved at working in child welfare, and what can we do to increase male interest and presence in uplifting children?
It's great. Great that you're doing that work. Yeah, I feel like I could talk about this for 2 hours, so I'm going to just try to find what I want to say. Gender norms shape everyone around the world, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're straight or gay. Gender norms are so ingrained in us from the moment we're born. And most of the time, we are completely impervious to them. There's studies that show that if we brought 2 babies here right now, and little babies, and put them in your arms, and we said, this is a girl and this is a boy, and recorded you for an hour playing with them, you would be a lot rougher with the boy and a lot more delicate with the girl. There's so much of that that's happening from the moment we're born that, tells people this is what men do, this is what women do. And that's part of it. From the moment that you're born, you're told if you're a man, taking care of children, engaging in childcare overall is just not what men do. And similarly for women, women don't, do computer science. I don't know, there's so much of, and so it affects both men and women. So I think part of the work really needs to be around how do we shift those norms. Amartya Sen, many years ago, I don't know if you've read him, wrote a book called Development is Freedom. And I like to take that idea more broadly to gender equality. I think gender equality is freedom. It means that you as an individual, no matter what your sex, your gender, your sexual orientation, get to decide what you want to do with your life. When, where, what career you want to have, whether you want to stay home and take care of kids, and it should all be okay. You know what I mean? So I think that's the vision that and so hopefully I think we're changing and we're getting there. There's still a long way to go, but it's also true around violence, because we teach boys from an early age to deal with their problems using violence. Um, and again, there's so many ways in which we do this. I mean, this idea that, there's this Gillette commercial. I don't know if you've seen it recently, you know, and some people criticize. I think it's great. I think we gotta have more role models of men who are doing the things you're doing, who are saying it's not okay to hit someone just because you're upset at them in the park, and, finding new ways to connect and to deal with problems is a huge way that we're gonna prevent violence from happening in the future. Because what we do with men is we say, stuff your feelings down and deal with it with violence. Our movies teach you that, our commercials teach you that, or everything. And so, yeah, sorry, I could keep going for a while, but hopefully that was a relatively straightforward answer.
Hi, my name is Rachel Edwards. I'm a biology of global health student at the college here. And very directly related to that question, as a 21-year-old woman, not a mother yet, how do I influence and work with the men and the boys that I interact with, in my regular daily circles, to build positive relationships and to build positive outlooks on women and how to treat children? Like, I'm not an adult yet. I'm not in a career setting yet. How is that related to my life?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I just want to make sure I say something, though, because it's so important. I don't believe that only men are sexist. I believe women are extremely sexist as well. And the gender norms I mentioned get associated, and taken in by both men and women. And so I think the work is around changing those norms, improving gender equality, and both with men and women. So I think that's also really important. There's some women who have, publicly been barriers to the advancement of women on many occasions politically, if you can think of a few. It's like, we all have to do this work. But working specifically, then going back to your question about men and boys, I talk to my husband a lot about this. He's a political scientist. He cares about economy and energy, and in some ways, he's a very typical guy. And so I love his take on, like, if I have something new, how does he feel about this? And I think one of the things that we've been thinking a lot about, and the Gillette commercial, if you haven't seen it, is basically a bunch of guys talking to each other about how to be better men. And, don't hit someone, like good role models, good examples. I think part of the challenge is that there are two things. One is there are a lot of good men, but that aren't speaking out. And so, having those conversations about, I'm hosting this dinner next week in Silicon Valley for, actually, there's going to be mostly men, and it's, they've asked me to come in and have a conversation with them. And my conversation starter is going to be, can you remember a time when you saw someone, do something that was violent or abusive towards a woman, whether it's emotional abuse or a comment or something, and you did nothing? And why? Why did you do nothing? To really start to get, I think, men to start thinking about, and you could do the same with women too, but in this case it's men, what is it that stops you from saying something, from doing something? And I think the more we can create, a space where the good men are stepping up and saying, that's actually not okay, and, you shouldn't be doing this, and that's going to be much more powerful than us women saying, you should be doing that, I mean, so I think having those conversations and just opening it up, like, what was the fear? And for a lot of guys, it's like, oh, I didn't want to be seen as the uncool one. I didn't feel like it was my place. There's so much there to unpack, but we need to unpack that if we're gonna make a difference. Yeah, so those are just some thoughts.
I'm just following on that. I was just thinking, and obviously this is very political, but President Trump's comments that were overheard in the bus. There were a lot of women defending those comments as that's just how men talk.
Right.
That's locker room talk. So don't get bothered by it. And I think that for many, many people, that is the reality. That it's just talk, and that's how boys talk, and women talk a certain way too, and everything's okay. And I think that getting to a point where it doesn't matter if it's the examples you gave of the cultural shift, the shift away from you don't make your children work in factories. That seems very self-evident, but a shift away of there is no such thing as boys will be boys talk, because it impacts people, it impacts women, it impacts children, and those impacts are bigger than you realize.
Totally. I totally agree. And the other thing, so I think the work with boys around that and men, and then the work with girls. So one of the interventions that's come out in terms of the evidence of what works to prevent sexual violence is this organization called No Means No Worldwide. And what they do, and they actually have some work in the US as well, is they'll take adolescent girls and young women, sometimes even smaller girls that are testing out now, and they'll do self-empowerment workshops, which is not, and self-defense workshops, but not necessarily just physical. There's a little bit of that, but it's really about how do you deal with certain real life situations. And I actually got them to come do this last weekend for my girls as part of the Girl Scout troop, and it blew me away. We were doing an exercise where these 10-year-old girls were walking around a room, and two of the facilitators were coming over and touching them on the shoulder, and supposedly they didn't want that, and saying, what do you do about it? And at first you could see the girls kind of trying to shake away or say, oh, please don't touch me. And then we learned, how do you stand? Look someone in the eye. Explain that you want them to stop. And we kept practicing it. And after 2 hours, I had tears in my eyes, because I was watching these little girls all of a sudden having permission to do that. And we have never talked to our girls like that. We don't do that, we don't teach. I get emotional just thinking about it. We don't teach that in schools. We don't. And so it's this be nice, be sweet, and then we expect that we're going to be in a situation that's uncomfortable and we're going to know what to do. So there's just so much work, I think, on all sides that still needs to be done on that. Yeah.
I agree with you, and I guess also to get back to your question, if it makes you feel any better, I look back in my life and try to think of, clearly there are times when I regret not saying things or doing things, but most of the learning that I've done in my life is through the kinds of conversations you've talked about, friends, my wife, people that I know. So I think there's hope in conversation that you may not see an immediate reaction or some dramatic Hollywood movie moment. But if you're engaged in a real dialogue with somebody who's a friend or colleague ultimately when you're working, and they can hear you and they're open to it, that's where you learn, at least for me. I mean, my understanding about the kind of barriers my women I worked with faced were really through hearing them vocalize. I would see an event and think, well, whatever, but then I would see how it would have this systematic effect that they wouldn't be as advantaged as I was. And this whole idea about being woke or privileged or whatever, it was not a concept I was familiar. I just assumed everybody went through the world seeing seeing it through my eyes, and it's just not true. But if you talk to people and listen, you can at least start to learn. And I will say it, if women and people of color who felt that exclusion don't speak up, you're likely to miss people who are in that potential audience. The burden's not on you, it's not your responsibility, but there's an upside if you feel like you can. And that's, I guess, just something, that's where I learn at least. You can read about this and you can see and think and look at data, all that's critically important, but there's something about hearing it from somebody that you have a relationship with that's really powerful.
Yeah, thanks. No, and that's why I think this class is great. I was thinking, yeah, have conversations, right? There's so much.
You're welcome anytime. Who else? I'm sorry.
I think tap on the top. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Zach Allen. I'm a junior in the School of Foreign Service. I'm a global health major also. And I was just thinking, sort of on a more personal note for all of us, I guess, or a more local note. Georgetown has been struggling over the past few years, I think, with a culture of violence, especially sexual violence on campus. And a lot of initiatives have been coming out that clearly the university cares a lot, but all of this is, I think, relatively new. So I was wondering, I don't expect you to be an expert in Georgetown, but from the perspective of the university and especially student clubs in the university, what can we do from a policy perspective to create a culture of nonviolence?
That's a fantastic question. Thanks for asking it. I think the reality is college campuses around this country are struggling. Going to college is actually one of the riskiest times for women in terms of sexual violence and assault, which is crazy, but it is what it is. There are a lot of things that a university can do. There's actually, and I'm happy to actually share some of this with you in writing also. But like, for example, Columbia did this amazing study over 4 years where they actually not only tracked interventions, but they also had a lot of conversations with people, et cetera. And sometimes, some of the obvious things are you need to have a post-rape care center on campus that operates 24/7. You have to have a way of, reporting something that happens where you feel safe and, whether it's against a faculty member or a peer, et cetera. So having all those reporting systems in place, you have to be able the university needs to respond, and I know that's been an issue here as well as other places, and take it seriously and investigate it and actually go through that instead of trying to cover it up and put it under the rug, which we see a lot of. I mean, there's all that stuff that I think is pretty self-evident and common sense that you need to have. But then also, for example, one of the things I remember reading about was, and I don't know what the policy here is, so I can't speak to that, but like the sororities weren't allowed to host the parties, but the fraternities were. And so the women would go to the fraternities for the parties, but then they weren't in their own space. And that actually made it more dangerous for them that if they were hosting in their own space with the guys coming over, because it was kind of like their turf, something is, maybe that's not very evident, but the data actually showed that made a difference. There are a lot of apps now that work on kind of buddy systems, and there's a lot of evidence that's starting to come out there where if you do that, that actually helps keep girls safe. But less studied is for men. Like, how do men, so that to your earlier point, so it's not all the women or on the men who are experiencing the violence, it's on the perpetrators. Like, how do buddies keep each other accountable around their behavior? And that's, I think, an area that is interesting. If someone has had too much to drink and you're in charge of kind of noticing what they're doing and pulling them back, So anyway, there's some innovative things that are coming out. I think the reality is there's a lot we know works, and it is insane to me that every university in this country isn't forced to actually implement all those things. So.
That's, I think, actually an excellent way to.
Sorry, it's a little somber note.
Well, no, because I give you a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry. It's about. I think your work is so much about holding us all accountable for what we know we need to do to make the world a better place. And institutions, in this case universities, obviously need to do their part. But anyway, we've taken up more of your time than we asked. But let me just thank you for joining us, Danielle. And